You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Belinda Francis, Norman Richmond. Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and joining us on the line, Dr. Gerald Horne, who holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, the author of nearly 50 books, and I guess his latest work is I Dare Say. And Dr. Horne is, we've been doing this for decades now. And how are you doing today, sir?
Oh, it's all good.
I guess the first question that we want to deal with, and the most burning question, I guess, is, the situation with Iran and Israel, and what does that mean for the world?
What it means for the world is this, and perhaps your team can make a clip of this point, because I think it's going to be relevant for some years to come. What I mean is that this crisis in Gaza, historic Palestine, now extended to Iran, exemplifies a major trend that we have not seen the likes of perhaps in centuries. What I mean is that Israel and its imperialist patrons, they continue to enjoy what could be called tactical victories. For example, massacring thousands of Hamas fighters in Gaza. For example, massacring Iranian leaders in Damascus, Syria, on April 1st, 2024, but then has to endure strategic defeats. Strategic defeats being, for example, the tattered global image of Israel in light of the depredations in Gaza, not to mention the fact that Iran showed on April 13th that it could reach Israeli soil with projectiles in a very clever fashion, forcing Israel to unmask what defensive procedures it would use to try to blunt this offensive, which will be valuable intelligence going forward for the Iranian authorities. And it's interesting to note that Trita Parsi, who is a leading scholar of Iran and a leading think tanker in Washington, on the New York Times website today, he has a piece suggesting that Mr. Biden, and in fact, my term, not his, U.S. imperialism, are suffering a similar strategic defeat with regard to its backing for Israel. And I would argue that this repetitive pattern of tactical alleged victories and actual strategic defeats stems from the fact that as of now, we've reached a fork in the road whereby the group of 7 countries, including the North Americans, the Western Europeans, and Japan, are being eclipsed by the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, perhaps soon to be joined by Algeria, Indonesia, perhaps Mexico. And that we have not seen such a paradigm shift on planet Earth, perhaps for centuries, since the rise of Western Europe, London in the first instance, buoyed by the depredations inflicted upon indigenous and the African slave trade. Then the baton passed to its revolting spawn in North America, speaking principally of the United States of America, which has now entered a stage of precipitous decline. And therefore, these strategic defeats stem from the fact that the imperialist nations are no longer able to shape global events. You see this in the political economy, whereby in order to compete with China, the United States has to violate its stated ideology of free markets and adopt industrial policy, which of course it never stopped introducing, even when it was espousing so-called free markets, but it's enhanced that. That is to say, it's handing out billions of taxpayers' dollars to try to develop a microchips industry to compete with China, You may be familiar with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is trying to allow U.S. imperialism to compete with China concerning green energy. The so-called CHIPS Act, aforementioned, allowing the United States supposedly to compete with China with regard to microchips, which go into your smartphones, increasingly go into automobiles. Speaking of automobiles, you see that Tesla, the major challenger in the field of electric vehicles, is on the back foot now, being challenged not only by BYD of China, but also Xiaomi. Xiaomi is also challenging Apple with regard to smartphones, as is Huawei, for example. So when you see the imperialist camp trying to ape the Communist Party of China, you get an idea of what I'm suggesting when I'm articulating this point, that we're undergoing a paradigm shift in the military diplomatic realm. This can only be followed by these strategic defeats. And in the economic field, you'll see these repetitive attempts of US imperialism and its allies too, by the way, such as Canada, to imitate the Communist Party of China, imitate the BRICS. But the question is it too little too late?
Yeah, that's the question. And how have the critics or the pundits, who's saying what on what front on that issue?
Well, you know how it is in the United States. I mean, there's a lot of ideological backwardness. This brings me to the positive aspect of what's going on, the mass protests in the United States against U.S. policy. Let's start with Columbia University and the students who are protesting that institution's complicity with genocide in Gaza. You probably know that the daughter of Congresswoman Omar Minnesota has been suspended from Columbia University because of her activism. Columbia University, of course, can be fairly considered to be a part of Harlem in northern Manhattan, although the neighborhood technically is called Morningside Heights. And we also know that the University of Southern California, in your neck of the woods in Los Angeles, they refused to allow a pro-Palestinian activist to provide a commencement address. They basically gave the Israeli Zionist thugs a heckler's veto, since USC argued that they could not provide security for that event. You know that in California in general, there have been protests about the US policy. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas has suggested that the violence be inflicted upon these protesters. We know that the president of Columbia was on Capitol Hill in Washington just this past week. She was hounded and harassed and threw a number of faculty members overboard to the Republican wolves. But I don't think that that will sate their voracious appetite. And so I say that on the one hand, but on the other hand, I think that there is a lack of ideological rigor in the United States with regard to these events that are unfolding before our very eyes. To give you one example amongst many, we have the spectacle of many Jewish Americans, not all, of course, because many of the protests that I've just mentioned involve Jewish Americans, but there are others who metaphorically, they put on their so-called white hat and they condemn so-called political correctness. They ascribe this descriptor identity politics to Black liberation struggles. They say that Black people who protest are snowflakes. They need to get some spine and backbone. And then they take off their white hat, sometimes without even recognizing it, and put on their Jewish hat and argue for the existence of the state of Israel because of what took place in Europe, from the Inquisition 500 years ago to the Holocaust concluding in 1945. They do not say that students at Columbia who object to pro-Palestinian protests, they don't say that they're snowflakes and they need to get a spine. Instead, they say that pro-Palestinian protesters need to be ousted altogether. And so you have this sort of hypocrisy and double standard. And it's not well recognized. And to give you one example amongst many, I know, Norman, that you've mentioned this intended insulting descriptor of identity politics applied to Black liberation struggles. I've never heard one person apply the term identity politics to a state, Israel, based upon an ethno-religious identity that gives special privileges based upon that identity. In fact, interestingly enough, in the Washington Post just a few days ago, a professor of Jewish studies at Indiana University in Bloomington wrote a letter reprimanding their pro-Zionist columnist Ruth Marcus, who had just come back from a junket to Israel. And of course, as so often happens, she puts the question of Israel, in fact, the question of Jewish Americans writ large, in the context of the centuries of history from the Inquisition to the Holocaust. But this professor of Jewish studies says, wait a minute, that's a European history. You have Jewish people in Israel and Jewish people in the region from Morocco to Iran. And the Inquisition to the Holocaust is not part of their history. And if it is, it's only so insofar as people fleeing Europe and coming to the region from Morocco to Iran. And likewise, in the United States of America, you would think that the United States is just an adjunct of Europe. Now, of course, in a sense it is. I've argued that the United States is the original European Union. But what I mean is a more organic tie, an umbilical cord between Europe and the United States, insofar as just like you had a Holocaust in Europe, you're going to have a Holocaust in the United States of America, which has not been part of the history of the United States, because, of course, the folks who argue that way, they don't want to acknowledge the obvious, which is that Jewish people were inducted into the hallowed halls of whiteness because the settler colonialists needed every body they could muster to keep the Native Americans in line and to bludgeon the enslaved Africans. And many Jewish people were willing to fill that bill. It's not like they came to the United States to join the protests against the United States. And that's a very bitter pill for many, I'm afraid to say, to swallow, but it's an exemplar of this lack of historical understanding, the lack of ideological rigor. And I would dare say that to the extent that we do not address these historical and knotty ideological problems, that our heroic protests eventually will wither on the vine to the detriment of us all.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. You were talking about the identity politics. I found an essay that I wrote in 1993. I was looking at it yesterday. And I wrote it for a publication. I guess they're Social Democrats. The article was Afrocentricity versus Eurocentricity. And I argued that my argument was that Afrocentricity was a righteous response to white supremacy. However, the weakness was that it ignored the class struggle. Many Afrocentrics say that it's all about race and class has nothing to do with it. Some Afrocentrics take the position, take more of a materialist position, and they say that, it's a question of class, race, gender, so on and so forth. And they rejected the article, and the whole question of identity politics, that reminded me of what we're talking about. That was in 1993, and I guess that argument probably was going on in 1983 and 1883, and will probably be going on for quite some time. Or would you agree with that?
Well, I think if you look in an etymological sense, the best of my understanding is this phrase identity politics is of recent vintage. Now, what it signifies in terms of a debate, it's not necessarily of recent vintage, but it's remarkable that many of the rhetorical tools that are adopted and adapted by ruling class spokespersons in the United States, oftentimes these tools are birthed in left circles, internecine left disputes, oftentimes involving Euro-Americans seeking to destabilize or discredit struggles, interestingly enough, of non-Euro-Americans, such as Black people. I mean, that's where the term political correctness comes from, which had a run for a long time. That comes from an attempt to discredit certain efforts on our part. And identity politics is in the same category. The term snowflake, which is also losing altitude because obviously it's a case of hypocrisy. Snowflake suggesting that those who object to racism need to buck up. They need to get a spine. Don't melt like a snowflake. Now, of course, obviously that's the height of hypocrisy, since students are being suspended at universities and harassed because of being in solidarity with Palestinians. And this is part of the hypocrisy that is rampant, not only in the United States, but to a degree has infected left-wing circles. And if we're not careful, we're going to be suffering as a direct result.
You're listening to Diasporic Music. Melinda, you have a question?
Yeah, let's get into the Sudan crisis.
Well, this week marks the first anniversary of the eruption of a conflict in Sudan, once the largest nation by territory on the African continent before the secession of South Sudan more than a decade ago, engineered by the US administration. But in any case, the Sudan that remains has been involved in bitter and bloody conflict. Thousands, if not millions, of people have been internally displaced or fleeing to neighboring countries, particularly Chad to the west, in order to find some sort of respite. Chad cannot necessarily absorb these refugees. It's undergoing turmoil all of its own as a result of the run-up to elections in a few weeks. Refugees are fleeing to South Sudan, fleeing to Central African republics, fleeing to Egypt, fleeing to Libya. The conflict ostensibly involves a battle between the military and a faction of the military, the Rapid Support Forces, backed by the United Arab Emirates. And close listeners to this program might have noticed that the UAE comes up frequently in our conversations, and I wish there are those who are so keen on denouncing the Chinese role in Africa would pay some attention to the UAE. In any case, this conflict is being subjected to mediation, but that has not borne fruit as of yet. You may recall, Norman, that some years ago in the 1980s, when I was with the National Conference of Black Lawyers, I was asked by the Union of Arab Jurists, who were part of that International Lawyers Conference in Toronto in the mid-1980s. They came as well and extended an invitation for me to come to Sudan to try to get involved in the mediation process of the then conflict between the North and the South. Obviously, that mediation process failed, since we know that South Sudan seceded from the larger Sudan, taking with it a good deal of that region's wealth, since a lot of the oil was based in South Sudan, coincidentally enough. I should also mention that US imperialism has played a malignant role in Sudan insofar as going back to Sudanese independence in 1956, and note that that's before Ghanaian independence in 1957, which is oftentimes given credit for igniting the decolonization process on the continent. More attention needs to be paid to the role of Sudan in that regard, particularly since Sudanese independence was backed avidly by Nasser's Egypt, and Nasser's Egypt played a critical role in supporting independent struggles in Algeria to the west, 1962, and Kenya to the east, 1963. In any case, Sudan, post-independence 1956, was a kind of bridge nation between so-called Arab Africa to the north and non-Arab Africa to the south. It also was a bridge in terms of housing one of the most significant communist parties on the African continent, second perhaps only to South Africa to the south. But at last, Sudan fell victim to Cold War tensions, the bludgeoning of the Communist Party, the arising in that vacuum of ethnic tensions and ethno-religious tensions, blooming not only in South Sudan and its eventual succession, but also in Darfur to the west. And therefore, it's important to underline and underscore the role that US imperialism has played up to and including the role of the Clinton regime in the 1990s, whereby in an emulation of the Hollywood movie Wag the Dog with Robert De Niro and Dustin Hoffman, Mr. Clinton, faced with a sex scandal, sought to deflect attention from his misdeeds by bombing Sudan, supposedly because it had a plant manufacturing elements for chemical and biological warfare, which tended to be false, to put it bluntly. But it also gave Mr. Clinton no postponement of the tensions emerging from this scandal. Then the George W. Bush regime, as noted, helped to engineer the secession of the South. The Trump team, 2016 to 2021 January, twisted the arm of Sudan to get it to engage in a kind of diplomatic recognition of Israel and dipping into the Sudanese treasury to pay out reparations to purported and alleged supposed victims of terrorism launched from Sudanese soil. That weakened the regime of President al-Bashir, leading to the military overthrow, and now the military are squabbling over the fruits of their action. And there you have it. Sudan is now enduring a famine that may approach the level of 1980s Ethiopia. The kind of turmoil that that's unleashing, as noted, is spreading like an oil spill across borders, not only to Chad and Libya and Egypt and Central African Republic, but also Eritrea and Ethiopia, which have unique episodes of unrest all their own. So this Sudanese conflict is a major crisis, and we need more attention on it.
I remember seeing a photograph of the first leader of the Sudan. I can't recall the brother's name, but he had just as much melanin as Kwame Nkrumah. And, Ilombe Brath used to always talk about, that fact, because I guess the imperialists have used the term south of Sahara or Black Africa versus Arab Africa. The first, as you pointed out, I think the Sudan was independent on January 1st, 1956, and Nkrumah didn't come into power until March 6th, 1957, I believe, right?
That is correct. And Sudan, as noted, exercises a lot of weight, or at least it did before this bout of unrest. And restoring its weight in the international community will be a boon for oppressed people worldwide. And in that context, let me move further west to Niger. I'm sure your audience is familiar with the change of regime, July 2023, the booting out of French forces. U.S. imperialism thought it would benefit, so it was low key with regard to the post-July 2023 events. But now U.S. imperialism is about to be booted out. The Russians and the Chinese have been invited in. And with regard to the latter, the Chinese National Petroleum Company has just inked a $400 million deal with Niger, which will obviously amplify its treasury. The petroleum, in case you're wondering, since Niger is landlocked, will be pumped through a multi-billion-dollar pipeline to Benin, which also will profit from this deal. And then the petroleum shipped into China. Now, this is the sort of deal that U.S. imperialism is objecting to, although it's not able to match China in terms of that kind of infrastructural improvement, that kind of ample monetary deal, although it can exceed China with regard to dumping military hardware into Africa, which is the last thing that Africa needs if it's determined to address issues of healthcare and education. But that is where we stand right now.
Can we move to the sports situation now? The brother Porter, Mr. Porter, Jontay, how do y'all pronounce his first name?
Jontay, I think.
Jontay Porter, I just found out his brother is on the Denver Nuggets, and I guess they're getting ready to, they beat the Lakers today, but he was in a betting scandal, and Mr. Silvers, the head of the NBA, they have banned this man for life, and in my judgment, I might be wrong, I think that's a little bit too harsh. Or would you agree with that?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I haven't studied the details. Apparently, he was collaborating with bettors and games he was actually playing in, and that goes to the integrity of the game, because if basketball approaches the ludicrous nature of professional wrestling, well, that whole multi-billion-dollar enterprise could sink like a balloon. The Porter family is having some real problems. The younger Porter brother has just been sent to prison. He was involved in some sort of automobile accident that had felonious consequences. I trust and I hope that this will not influence unduly the brother still playing, Michael Porter. But NBA, basketball, sports, in a certain sense, this is a self-inflicted wound, because right now, sports are invading the professional sports space. We see that the Adelson family, a major supporter of Mr. Netanyahu and of Mr. Trump, with major gambling interests in Nevada, Las Vegas, have bought the Denver Mavericks. It's becoming simple with your smartphone to bet on just about every aspect of a game, from whether this player will get X number of rebounds, or whether this player will sink the next free throw, or whether even this player will get into the game. And so the NBA has been blinded by the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And then when you have the inevitable consequence, which is that these young men like Jontay Porter, they wonder why can't they get in on the action, and they wind up with a lifetime ban. It's a very curious, paradoxical episode indeed.
Could we talk about the head of state, Mr. Scholz, in going to China?
Well, yeah, this is part of the new Cold War. That is to say, Washington wants to focus like a laser beam on China, but is bogged down in Ukraine, about to be bogged down in West Asia, Israel, Iran in particular. And in any case, the so-called European allies are not on board. Chancellor Scholz of Berlin was in China this week with a plane load of businessmen trying to cut deals. He was preceded by President Macron of France with a similar plane load of French businessmen. And interestingly enough, as Mr. Scholz was landing, an article was dropping at the Council on Foreign Relations publication, Foreign Affairs, which is the elite journal for foreign policy mandarins in the United States, at least, that's urging not only a new Cold War, but the overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party. And this article was inked by Matt Pottinger, a former Trump aide, maybe next Secretary of State if Mr. Trump is elected in 2024, and Mike Gallagher, a hawkish former congressman. They make the bald argument that a Cold War with China would help to reduce polarization in the United States. Polarization meaning meaning this constant squabbling between different factions on the left and the right, between liberals and conservatives, because both and all factions can unite on an anti-China platform. And given what we've said about the hostility to China in some Black liberation circles, it could probably unite a significant percentage of the Black community as well. And so this is something we're going to have to guard against, because the basic question to ask, amongst others, is that if the United States could not subdue Korea, could not subdue Vietnam, could not subdue Afghanistan, and how in the hell are they going to subdue the People's Republic of China? It's just going to be a waste of money in a nation that has hunger skyrocketing, that has homelessness accelerating, and yet they're counseling spending billions, if not more, on a new Cold War with China. It's insanity of the rankest sort.
And you are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We only have 2 minutes left. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Well, just some books I've been reading. I read this book by May Ngai, Ngai, called The Chinese Question. It's on the Chinese population, the gold rushes of the United States, that is to say California, Australia, and South Africa. It's very interesting. It's worthwhile. I read this other book by an Iranian scholar, The Color Black: Enslavement and Erasure in Iran. You had enslavement of East Africans and others in Iran for centuries. The others were mostly from the Caucasus. The East Africans, who of course were disproportionately coming from Zanzibar. Slavery was only abolished in 1929 in Iran under global pressure. And then, as the title suggests, there's then erasure, an attempt to act as if this never happened, so to speak, where Black Iranians are oftentimes perceived to be foreigners, for example, even though, as I said, for centuries, there had been enslavement of Africans in Iran. I was thinking about interviewing the author, but given the tensions between the United States and Iran, I thought it would inflame the Black audience unduly, who could easily be stampeded into an anti-Iranian psychosis. Anyway, I see our time is up, so I'll stop there.
All right, we have been speaking with Dr. Gerald Horne, and